Good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Atoshi Nanda Goswami, convener of this program. With me, our co-convener, Professor Meruna Murmu. It's a delight to meet you all today, although virtually. We are looking forward to have an enriching experience. Thank you again for joining us today. Now, we begin the inauguration program of our 2 days conference on sustainable development, taming consumption, yearning for inclusivity. Our guest of honors are Dr. Praveen Arora, advisor DST, Dr. Deepak Kumar, former professor JNU, Dr. Sheila Prasad, former professor Hyderabad University, Dr. Anita Singh, professor BHU, Dr. Jinia Mukherjee, assistant professor, IIT Kharagpur, Dr. Pranab Sen, country director, International Growth Centers India program, has accepted our request for delivering the keynote address. Now I request Professor Pradosh Nath, Director, Center for Knowledge, Ideas and Development Studies, to chair the session and begin the program. Over to you, sir.
Good morning to all of you. Dr. Atoshi Nanda Goswami has already introduced the guest here. I think Dr. Arora has not joined yet. Dr. Sheila Prasad also has not joined. But let's begin our... Sheila, have you joined?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I think they will join gradually. We begin the program. Before we begin the program today, I will just like to brief you about our organization. Ours is Center for Knowledge, Ideas and Development Studies. We call it NEEDS. NEEDS means KN, knowledge is KN. So it's NEEDS. Our work area essentially is science and technology for development and problems related to that. Also focusing on the development of the rural economies. We also work on the cultural, socio-economic and cultural issues related to development. In 2018, we had organized an international conference on folk performing arts. We were guided and helped by Professor Anita Singh at that time, professor of Benares Hindu University. We are publishing a book. It's an outcome of that conference. Is in the press. Is being published by Hamilton Press, London. On SNT related developmental issues, we were guided and supported by Dr. Praveen Arora of Department of Science and Technology. During the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, we could organize a series of lectures, about 70 lectures, and Professor Sheila Prasad was there and Professor Deepak Kumar was there. They almost patronized us to continue with that webinar program. We have brought out a book based on the lectures delivered in that series of webinar lectures. This is the book. The title of the book is Lives and Livings, Learning to Know at the Time of Pandemic. This learning to know, we have borrowed from Albert Camus' one of the least known novel, A Happy Death, because we thought that, well, his writing on plague, that plague novel probably tells us something about the impact of a pandemic like plague. So it's borrowed from Camus, that novel. We have received, as I was telling you, that we have received fantastic response for this program. About 200 participants registered already. There are more than 50 requests for contributions. We could not accommodate everybody. We could accommodate only 36 of them. And we are sorry for that. We would have loved to accommodate all of them. And we have got already have received requests for publications of the volume based on this conference output from international publishers and also from our Indian publishers. So that we are very enthused about the kind of responses we have received, both from the publishers as well as participants and scholars working in this area. We are thankful to Professor Pranav Sen. He has agreed to provide us he has agreed to deliver the keynote address today. I would request my colleague, Dr. Tamal Datta Chaudhuri, to introduce Dr. Pranav Sen. Please, Professor Chaudhuri.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pranav Sen. Dr. Pranav Sen is Country Director, International Growth Centers India Program, and is editor of Indian Journal of National Income and Wealth. He is also member of the high-level expert group on measurement of economic performance and social progress of OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the technical advisory group of the International Comparison Project of the World Bank. Previously, he was chairman of the National Statistical Commission, the first principal economic advisor at India's Planning Commission, the first chief statistician of India, and secretary, Minister of Statistics and Program Implementation. He was the principal author and coordinator of 3 5-year plans and midterm appraisals. He has chaired a number of government committees, most notably on economic statistics, ecological fragility, control of prices and essential drugs, and slums. Dr. Sen received his BA Honours in Economics from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, his MBA and MA in Economics from the George Washington University, USA, and his PhD in Economics from the Johns Hopkins University. So, Dr. Sen, the floor is all yours to begin your keynote address.
Thank you, Kamal. It is indeed a privilege to be here. And I was delighted to learn of the success that NITS has registered in terms of its conferences, webinars, and publications. In particular, the notion of sustainable development, it's become pretty much a catchword now around the world. But in a lot of cases, I think the central issue has been skirted. And that's what I'd like to touch upon while we go ahead with this conference, which is why I'm so excited about it, and I will come to that. But I don't know whether you are aware, the first time the phrase sustainable development was used in the world was in India's 4th 5-year plan. And this was in the late 60s, before it had become, as I said, so popular in the international discourse. And every 5-year plan from the 4th plan onwards has had sustainable development as a centerpiece. The problem, of course, is that conceptualizing the notion of sustainability isn't quite so easy. For the longest time, it was essentially viewed as efforts to preserve the natural heritage of any geographical area and try and develop economic activities in a manner where those natural endowments are not destroyed. But this, of course, is asking for too much. Just the process of development does have impact on the environment, no matter how hard you try. And the basis for that is really comes from the fact that practically anything that we use other than services is fundamentally extractive in nature. So the real question that had been perplexing people while they were thinking about sustainable development was essentially a technology issue, which is that for any level of consumption, is it technically possible to minimize the amount of extraction or pollution, the two sides of the environmental damage? And the solutions were essentially technological. It was science and technology which led the way. But the fact of the matter is that ultimately science and technology can only address that which is. That which should be is a different ballgame altogether. And this is why this particular conference excites me. It is that for the first time that I have seen on any discussion around sustainability, we have a conference that is focusing on consumption and inclusivity. Consumption in particular, inclusivity causes us a problem, and I will touch upon that. The reason why consumption needs to be the focus is that it is the act of consumption which leads to the act of production, which then leads to extraction and pollution. And so until and unless one addresses the consumption issue and the consumption patterns, we will always be running well behind the curve, which is what has been the experience over the globe, that consumption will continue to move and science and technology will try all it can do to minimize the damage that the growth in consumption leads to. So if you want to actually address the problem at its source, it needs to be addressed at the level of consumption. And that is the recognition that this conference has brought right to the fore. And I compliment the organizers for this perspective, and I hope that this will be a bellwether of research in the coming years. Let me now talk a little bit about the nature of the problem and the reason why the notion of inclusivity is so important. If one looks at consumption and the patterns by which consumptions evolve over time, at the heart of it is that there are particular categories of people who set consumption standards, and others then aspire to those consumption levels. By the time the process of people who are aspiring to higher consumption levels start reaching that, the people who are leading the process have already moved forward to a different stage of consumption. And this becomes a continuous chain. The question that one really needs to ask is that if this is the process, then sustainability can happen in only one of two ways. The first is those who are trendsetters, their consumption patterns move in a direction which is more sustainable. But so far, what has been observed empirically has been that is simply not the case. More importantly, The question is that as people aspire to higher and higher levels of consumption, which is being determined by the trendsetters, what you get are enormous increases in those forms of consumption which do lead to high levels of environmental damage. The greater the term that you have used is inclusivity, the larger will be the effect. Simply because you're getting larger and larger number of people who are now consuming in a manner which is unsustainable. The question that really then comes up is, what is the solution? And before we can answer that question, I think one of the things that we do need to understand and work on is to understand what is the consumption pattern, which if everybody in a country were following, would be sustainable. So in a sense, a norm, an average, as it were, around which you would want clustering to happen as you proceed with the inclusivity paradigm. This is not easy to do, but it's necessary to do so, because it's those patterns of consumption that then have to be propagated and to be made, quote unquote, to be made something that people desire. And desire is a very nebulous term. The problem, of course, we don't have this sense of what is the consumption pattern. And when you look around the world, what you find that consumption patterns are so cultural and social specific that it is impossible to have a single consumption pattern that everybody in the world can aspire to, and we shouldn't even try. The question that we do need to address is that for any relatively homogeneous set of people in terms of their culture and social norms, what is a consumption basket that is inherently sustainable? The good part of all of this is that if we can actually identify that, then it is possible for science and technology to be able to focus in those areas, reduce the environmental footprint, and therefore allow higher levels of consumption to happen in the future. Otherwise, what happens is that science and technology focuses only on those elements that are currently in the stage of growth. And this can become an unstable process. And that's the nature of the problem that we are facing now. As I said, science and technology is simply running behind the curve with consumption setting the needs. And that is what we need to break. This is essentially a sociological problem. And it has to be addressed at the sociological level. But before one can address that, we do need to have a sense of what are consumption patterns that are sustainable. And it's the highest consumption pattern that we will be talking about. The research on this, so far as I know, is practically non-existent. We do know, for instance, that even at relatively low levels of poverty, high levels of poverty, unsustainability can still take place. And this happens all the time. With growing populations, we do know that a lot of agricultural practices are unsustainable. Technology has addressed a lot of those. But as we move forward, and as we move to higher levels of income and consumption, the needs keep changing. And the most fundamental issue out here is the nature of human society. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to keep right in front of our minds. The first of them is that as the human population grows, the needs of people and goods moving from one place to another will go up. It cannot happen otherwise. Now, this is something that we do know leads to a lot of environmental damage. But the point is, there's not much one can do about it. We cannot go back to talk about the village-centric society that Mahatma Gandhi had talked about. That's no longer an option. Aspirations have gone too far ahead for us to even consider that as a viable alternative. I think the global experience is that urbanization is going to continue to happen. And with urbanization, there are demands that are placed on the environment, which we need to face up to very squarely. And one of the most important of these needs is climate control. But if you leave aside that particular issue, I mean, as we move from hand fans to electric fans to air conditioners to central air conditioners and so on, where mobility itself has now started becoming sort of environmentally sensitive in terms of the ambient temperatures. All of these things will happen and will continue to happen as the process of urbanization takes place. And urbanization, by its very nature, is a system by which different urban agglomerates have to transact with each other. There can be no other way it can be done. There is no urban agglomeration which can be self-sufficient on its own. This is something we have to take into account. The question, of course, is that where do we start in terms of the needs? Can we actually say that people should not consume whatever it is? Let's say air conditioning. You may say it, but it's not going to happen. So we need to actually start from the notion of what are the needs that people aspire to have fulfilled. How are these aspirations being created? And how can these aspirations be met with the least environmental damage? That is the sequence of thought. The problem with that sequence of thought is that we then need to be able to delve and go deeply into the nature and process of aspiration creation. This is something where there is some work, but unfortunately not enough, and in India, practically nothing. Now, this is relatively difficult to do, because what you are then trying to do is essentially to have social scientists who are going into not just the sociology, but the psychology of aspiration formation. Because if we are unable to understand this, then our ability to even talk about the process of inclusivity becomes impaired. And this is something that I would hope would take up a lot of the time of conferences like this, not necessarily this one, because I was looking at the papers and I really did not see anything which pointed towards a sustainable consumption pattern. But the moment you bring inclusivity into it, so you started out by saying taming consumption. So you have recognized the need to tame consumption. But tame consumption to what? To what level? And can you do it? Because in order to tame consumption, what you are saying in effect, that those who set the consumption trends have to be brought down to what you consider sustainable. That is a relatively difficult process. What is more possible is to be able to understand the process by which the aspirations are toned down as the process of inclusivity improves. As people start moving up, start getting closer and closer to the norm, what are the kind of aspirations they have in terms of their consumption? That is easier to control than to control the consumption patterns of those who've already moved significantly beyond. So this is, in a sense, I think, something that social scientists at large, and as I said, at the heart of all of this, to my mind, is really social anthropology and psychology. And at some point in time, we will have to then bifurcate our efforts in two directions. One direction, which is already settled and has been progressing very well, which is the science and technology inputs to mitigate and minimize the damage that is caused. But on the other side, the bigger issue is how do you get into the process by which aspirations are muted, but not muted in the sense of consumption, but muted in the sense of their environmental footprint. That is a much more of a social communications problem. But before we get to communication, we must first have an answer. And we are still groping towards that answer. And to my mind, this conference is the first that I have seen, which is leading us in that direction. And I compliment the organizers, and I really look forward to the deliberations of this conference.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. I think it was most illuminating, at least for us. And you have really raised the main issues that we also had in mind. And I think you have pointed out very rightly that there is no contribution whatsoever from the perspective of how to actually tame the consumption. I mean, what would be the right set of consumption level? But there are papers that gives examples, such as a few empirical studies. I have gone through the abstracts. They have tried to touch upon the issues that like how one can actually have alternative technology to address this kind of problem. So, but I'm very happy, and I feel really nice that you have appreciated the, the central theme of the conference that we are in now. So, we would love to be in touch with you and to guide us in our future endeavors and the kind of work we do. So we look forward to your association, closure association with us in future. Are you interested to take a few questions or clarifications?
Oh yes, I'm more than happy to take questions.
Okay. So there is Manjushri has something to. Manjushri, can you read it out, or I read it out for you?
It may be better for her to ask directly.
Yeah. Manjushri, if you are there, then please. I think she is not there.
Yeah.
And I would ask, I would request our guests if they have anything to add with this. Genia Mukherjee is there, and Professor Deepak Kumar is there, Professor Anita Singh is there, and Professor Sheila Prasad is also there. Please, if you want to add something to what Dr. Sen has told us, it would be nice to hear in your nephew. Yeah, Deepak, please.
Thank you, Professor Sen. It was quite a delight to listen to you, and very relevant points you made. And consumption, I was also worried about that how these big companies, through their advertisement, etc., have induced a society oriented towards consumption. We all fell to the trap at some point in life or the other and became big consumers. Earlier, our forefathers had also talked about it in terms of what probably you miss, sir, is greed. Magrda. This is what Tagore talks about. So, but this greed, so difficult to control, sir. And how do we, for example, what our great industrialists need anymore? How do you rein in the big commercial empires, industrial empires? So difficult.
Professor Kumar,
yes, sir.
Let me put it this way. I did not forget grief. Okay. Greed is central to what I was saying, except I was a little more polite. I called it aspirations. But aspirations are essentially greed. That's all they are.
Yes, sir, I have different question. Maybe a request to you. First of all, thanks a lot for this very rich overview lecture. And we could exactly place the different linkages between consumption and like aspiration, behavioral choices, technological advancements, and things like that. So my request to you would be, maybe I am also not aware of statistics and data. And as you are coming from, such a background, so the request is that there is a whole lot of debates and discussions going on so far as this issue of sustainability is concerned. So, like maybe 10 years back, when there were questions about sustainability, it was more on sustainable development. So that 1992 Brundtland Conference report and those kind of things. But later now we can see that there has been a change in that trajectory of scholarship, where the emphasis is now more on sustainability and not sustainable development. And sustainable development has gone to the backdrop a bit. So the legacy is still being continued, but a whole lot of fresh and new ideas pouring into the sustainability debate. So sir, my question to you would be that we are, at least I am not very aware of data sets about like Indian trajectory to this particular notion of sustainability. So number one, like how India has conceptualized sustainable development and sustainability in, which can be found out from the planning reports, and also statistics wise, how the data sets that our country has in terms of like production, in terms of like exports, in terms of several other like economic factors. So how our country has kind of addressed to this particular notion of sustainability in its like both ideological vision and practices, and how this global concept of sustainability and India's national and regional like visions, goals, and practices actually talk to each other. So if there can be like some, any report or any comprehensive like how do I say, write-up on this particular thing, so that India can, we can really understand that this is India's position so far as the issue of sustainability is concerned.
Okay. Ginia, let me begin with something you said right at the beginning of your intervention, which is the notion of sustainability and sustainable development. And what you said was earlier the discourse was about sustainable development. Now it seems to move to sustainability, right? This again is something which depends upon where you happen to be. For the countries which lead the discourse on sustainability, they're all developed countries. Countries like ours, for us, development continues to be important. This conference has inclusivity as a fundamental component. Inclusivity will not happen unless there is development, right? So far as we are concerned, sustainable development continues to be important and will be important for the foreseeable future. So again, I think we are getting caught in the trap of saying, how do we make our current consumption pattern sustainable? Which means that we are being told, be content with what you have. Let the poor remain poor and do underconsumption. Just let's make it sustainable. Now, that's not a trap that we really want to fall into. Okay? That's number one. Now, in terms of what our sort of thinking on sustainability has been at a national level, as I said, the focus has always been essentially on minimizing the extractive element of our development process. All right? It's always been at this in terms of what goes into the production process. We came to the pollution part of it much later, after a lot of damage has been done. So we have a situation where, as I said, we have been talking and integrating the notion of sustainability since the late 60s. But we are one of the most polluted countries in the world, right? Our focus has always been to look at what is the input intensity of our production processes, right? Now that pollution has become a major issue, the focus is starting to shift. But that doesn't mean that the focus should now shift entirely out of the production side to the side of pollution. We'll have to do both. Right? Now, think of what is happening. Technologically, the two are actually pretty closely linked. But when you add to it the question of affordability, which is where the inclusivity problem comes in, and this has been a part of Indian planning. When it comes to affordability, the alternatives to the extractive, pollutive nature of our development process becomes much more expensive and actually retards inclusion. Now, this has been recognized right from the late 60s up to now. The point is we haven't been able to address the question of the consumption side, right? So we've never actually defined what we think are sustainable level of consumptions for all Indians. Now, what that does is we can very easily get to a situation where our development process is sustainable, but where some people are living unsustainably, and a lot of other people are making up for it by living miserable lives. That throws your inclusivity out of the window right away. But this is the way the world has progressed. The whole climate change convention is saying what? You let us live our lives with as much pollution as we wish to bring out, whereas you adjust because you haven't gotten here yet. All right? That's not what we wish to follow. So we are going to have to set standards for ourselves.
Yes, sir, I'm Manjushri. I have a small query to Dr. Pranav Sen that I have written it on the chat box also. What would be the possible solution for keeping the sustainability intact in terms of keeping a good environment or maintaining our natural fabric in a region, especially where mining takes place and indigenous people of these areas are not going to avail the fruit of this development, as their consumption needs, cultural practices are different from the mainstream society. So it seems that sustainability of so-called development is happening that is not a pro-nature centric on its mode, and sustainability of nature is somewhere sidelined from the mainstream development agenda. So, sir, would you like to address this issue?
Manjushri, it is not that the sustainability of nature has not been taken into consideration. In fact, that has been the primary focus. Okay. But again, the thing is, the kind of solutions that you have depends really upon what is it that you're aiming at. So the whole discourse has actually moved away from preserving nature qua nature to preserving things like green cover. They're two very different things, right? But this is what the whole climate change debate has done. We have committed ourselves to net zero. What it means, in effect, is not that we're not going to cut down forests. What it means, in effect, is we will plant more trees than the trees we cut down. Not the same thing at all. Now, this is the whole notion of sustainability has to be rooted in a definition as to what is it that you consider desirable and should be sustained. So if you are talking about the sort of things you are talking about, to my mind, is very important. And these are issues of biodiversity. These are issues of cultural heterogeneity. These are all very important. The point is, do people see it that way? So if when Tamal was introducing me, he mentioned that I chaired this committee on ecological fragility in India. And the whole notion, the reason the government of India set up that committee was the recognition that biodiversity and ecology, the process of speciation, is important and must be preserved. So the more homogeneous our natural habitat becomes, the lower the level of speciation, which raises the overall risk for humanity. The point is, this is a recognition which, unfortunately, and we did a fair amount of work in terms of identifying what were the types of ecological fragility that we need to protect ourselves from. And at that time, which was in the early 2000s, what were the geographic areas which desperately needed protection here and now? The problems in the 20 years that have passed since then, a lot of those areas have already been disturbed, although that is a report that was accepted for implementation by the government. Now, this is something, and that's why the sociological imperative, which is that how do you communicate this We are doing a lousy job of communications, I'm afraid. And that's what we need to focus on. Otherwise, the issues you're raising, Manjushri, are not going to be addressed.
Professor Sen, may I ask a question?
Sure, Maruna.
Yeah, Dr. Sen, thank you so much. Yeah.
So, well, I'll take in from a sentence that you had uttered during this deliberation. You, unless there is development, there will not be inclusivity. But belonging to a community which is persistently being displaced, forcefully displaced, and we are the ones who have to bear the brunt of the so-called development. Don't you think this sort of an emphasis on technocentric development and corporate-driven, state-sponsored development has to take into the cost that human lives have to bear, because it's just not, if you are talking about taming consumption and if you're talking about inclusivity, it should be whose development is it, if not the people actually were seen to conserve environment for so long together. So don't you think the question, the sort of emphasis that is put on sustainability and develop is a bit lopsided?
No, it is lopsided. You know, the fact of the matter is that it is not sustainability which is putting the burden. It is the process of development, and it is a process of development which in and of itself is non-sustainable. And the kind of problems that you're talking about, Maruna, and I completely agree with you. That is a development process which is hugely unsettling in its nature, is inherently not sustainable, because what happens when the forests, when our tribes have been completely displaced and no longer exist? Who then bears the brunt? Today, unfortunately, there are particular areas and particular communities who are acting as shock absorbers for the development of the rest of the economy. Right? Now, it's a convenient way for society, for the society at a larger sense, to go ahead saying that, you know, what we are doing, and, you know, you can couch it in very democratic terms, saying the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Yes, a few people get hurt very badly in the process. Well, you know, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. This is the typical argument. That's an argument which has to be addressed. And therefore, the notion of sustainability really has to be, in a sense, broken up into its component parts. We don't do it. We try to club all of it together and put it into a sort of an average kind of a number. That's wrong. That's inherently wrong. The real issue is that so long as the consumption pattern demands extraction, the kind of damage you're talking about will continue to happen. There is no two ways about it. So we need, that is why this conference is important, that can we change the discourse on consumption and development away from those consumption patterns which are inherently extractive to consumption patterns which are not. Do we have such instances? Yes, we do. Can we popularize them? Perhaps we can. It's not something an economist is competent to speak on. This is something people who are in social psychology, who are in social anthropology, and in communications who would be able to answer this. But until and unless we start focusing on unsustainable consumption patterns, we will not be able to address the problem you're raising.
Can I just, Professor Sen, thank you for that. Thank you for that, overview, which really brought in a lot of, strands into, which will be very useful, I think, for the next 2 days. And I'm really glad that you focused on consumption, because usually in most environment debates and the discourse, the whole focus has been on population, overpopulation, rather than on lifestyles and consumption, reducing consumption. It's always about reducing fertility rates and population growth. So I think that shift is very necessary and important. Not that population growth is not a problem, okay? But I'm just wondering, your critique of the mainstream development model, which in turn feeds into the whole narrative of consumption and, profit maximization, capitalism. You stopped at something, which I, in my talk, am really fleshing out, is worldviews. What is the dominant? I mean, if you don't change a worldview, you cannot change this whole notion of, because all of us have now internalized that more consumption is good. So unless we, and I'm not saying it's an easy trajectory, but I think it's the whole worldview that we have now accepted, legitimized, which is really, making us accept consumption as good, and this particular extractive, resource intensive development model as good. So I'm really happy, because I think when for me, when I speak, I would really draw on this and maybe hopefully take it a little forward in the discussion and the critiques.
No, Sheila, I completely agree. So when I talked about aspiration formation, I was not just talking about the poor.
Yeah.
I was talking about you, me, and the Indian rich.
Absolutely.
They are developing their aspirations. We are developing our aspirations from what is happening in the West. So the notion of aspiration formation is much more broad-based. And we are the predominant ones who are guilty of this.
Guilty, absolutely.
We are guilty because we are borrowing from there and then setting the example.
Yes.
For people in India who are at the lower levels of the society.
Yes.
So we are acting as middlemen. And that is a guilt that you and I will bear for a long time to come.
Correct. Thank you.
Just to add to what Sheila has said, that, in the present worldview, except population is the burden. Population is the burden, but rest of the thing is resources. Population is not resource. But if you think population as, instead of thinking it as burden, but if you think it in terms of resources, population as resources, so the whole worldview can change. So, the focus has to change from seeing population as burden to population, how we can create, how we can convert this population to human resource. So, once it becomes a resource, then it's no longer a burden. So, so that worldview requires to be changed. This is a very interesting point that you have raised.
No, Pradesh Babu, I'm sorry. The West very much recognizes population as a resource.
Yeah.
Except they are very careful as to which parts of which populations are identified as a resource.
Okay. Yeah.
The rest of us are burdens.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Be clear.
Yeah, I agree to that. Yeah.
And that happens also in India, like what Haruna said, certain populations are seen as a burden, as not important, while there are a small minority who call the shots. So
When I said it, I was actually referring to that part of the population which you think is burden.
Yes.
No, I do. So this is actually, frankly, Pradosh, this is more common among our elite than among the elite of the West.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry to say this, but this is true.
I agree.
May I request Professor Anita Singh to say something?
Thank you so much. Your discussions are so interesting. This is not my area, but it has been absolutely enlightening for you. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, I must say.
I'm glad.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words.
Dr. Juneja, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Nothing much at the moment. Maybe later I join.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Deepak, Deepak, please. Just a moment. I think you have to be.
Thanks, sir. A very enlightening discussion. I just wanted to know a little more about maybe on the connection between consumption and corruption.
Well, consumption is the root of corruption. If you did not aspire to consume more than what your means allow you to do, you would not be corrupt. It is only when you have that aspiration or greed that you then try to augment what you have legitimately with that which you need to obtain illegitimately.
Some time ago, when I was drafting my Trishanku Nation, I had a discussion with some of my young prodigal relatives, engineers, IIT graduates, and now they are all millionaires. They said, look, consumption is important because, this will propel development. It's consumption which makes us desire. So why should you say something, but what is wrong in consumption? Were our forefathers in ancient times, were they less consumerist? Our kings will look Taj Mahal or lots of other things, or our temples. They're also symbols of consumption.
Of course.
And at the same time, probably corruption.
Yes, indeed. No, this is at the heart of economics. Economics is based on one critical assumption, otherwise the whole discipline breaks down, and that is that our desire to consume is limitless. Moment you start putting limits to it, a lot of your standard economics will simply break down. Okay? So greed and perpetual greed is at the heart of the way we have evolved the discourse. Now, if we want to change that, and I think we should, we need to start from first principles, which is to say, how do we address that greed problem?
And if you look at the present budget, I mean, it's there in every budget also, but after post-pandemic budget, the focus is that how do you increase consumption?
Yes.
So that the rest of the thing will follow.
Yes.
So actually, the idea of this present conference was taken from there. That is it the solution? Post-pandemic, we are focusing on more and more consumption so that the economy comes back to the whatever the earlier position was.
Well, you see, on this, Prabhu, the thing is that the kind of damage that happened, particularly with the reverse migration, there has been a lot of consumption damage that has taken place, and which, frankly, if you are concerned about inclusivity, is something that we need to restore as quickly as possible. It is not the consumption of the people who didn't lose anything. Unfortunately, that's the direction things seem to be taking. But people who lost enormous amounts, we really do need to focus on them, and we haven't. The budget has done absolutely nothing for them.
That is promoting consumption. Which I choose that section of the population where the consumption is to be raised.
Yes,
it cannot be general consumption.
No, this is
which anyway will be redirected to the those who can consume.
Yes, but the way you have to raise that consumption should be in a way that is sustainable, both economically as well as environmentally.
Exactly.
That's the point. So, free doles are not going to do it for you. It has to be built into a process where these two sort of attributes have to be looked on simultaneously.
I think we don't want to retain you further, but we would love to see you in our subsequent sessions.
Sure, I'll be popping in off and on.
So that would be nice. We'd like to hear from you your comments and views on the other sessions as well.
Sure.
So we come to an end. I will request Professor Maruna to convey our thanks to Dr. Sen and our guests. We are going to start our next session at 11:30. So please join us at 11:30 after Maruna conveys our gratitude and thanks to Dr. Sen and other guests. Professor Maruna, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much for roping me in. I'm a sleeping partner, and I was really very happy that KNIDS has chosen this theme. This is very close to me. As I said, we are the ones who bear this so-called development for national interest. And so the inclusivity was actually is very close to my heart. Thank you, Professor Sen, for talking about taming of consumption in the way that it should be. Dr. Juneja, do you want to ask a question?
Dr. Juneja wants to probably say something. Please, Dr. Juneja.
Good morning to you all. I'm asking a very basic and fundamental thing which I want to understand. All our system, including economic, stock exchanges, everything or even the country as such, towards growth, positivity, numbers increasing, whether of a company, whether stock exchange, wherever we go. And here we are talking of taming consumption. To me, it was really contradictory. I'm not a novice on the subject, admit. Apology for that. But my understanding is I kept even thinking every company, when it doesn't grow in numbers, the listed price of the shares would go down. And if probability goes down, they also go down. So like this, I've seen some companies where they were priced something 400 rupees, 500 rupees of a equity share and come to only 5 rupees, 3 rupees, 50 paisa, something like that. And they keep on jumping. Just to quote an example, Tata Tele Services, just I'm giving an example. The price of the share was when I bought was 25 rupees. And it went down to 3 or 4 rupees. I forgot about it, though I had some shares. Suddenly, somebody who's tertiary auditor told me, your price has jumped. Then I sold ultimately what I shared at 160 rupees. You see, I'm wrong to give an example of Tata's, something of that kind. But what I'm saying is that is a very dicey situation where if you're talking of taming consumption, how the company will grow, how the number will increase, how the GDP will increase, what will happen? Don't you think it's all a contradiction? I'm sorry for this very fundamental question, which I had.
No, Dr. Juneja, it's a perfectly legitimate question. But let me try to put it this way. there are several pathways to growth, right? One pathway is that the rich keep getting richer, setting higher consumption standards. The second way is that everybody grows together. The third way is that the rich stay exactly where they are and the poor grow. All three will give you growth, mind you, and your stock markets will continue to do well. Okay? The question is, which is more sustainable and which is more equitable? So you can think of different pathways and then focus on a pathway that we find both rationally and ethically supportable. That's the way we need to think about it. And take it from me, what will happen is, supposing we say we'll get the consumption of the poor up, you're going to get a hell of a lot of growth out of that. And as this growth takes place, science and technology works towards reducing the ecological footprint of the new consumption that is taking place. This process can go on for a long, long time. Right? The problem, of course, is that if the top keeps going up, up, and up, setting new consumption standards, we will be following a never-ending spiral. And that would be terribly dangerous for not just us as a country, but for the planet as a whole.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. And Maruna, it is up to you now to conclude this session.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a lively deliberation amongst the speakers and who all are invited guests, and that is what seminars are meant to be. So thank you so much, all those who have been here, and I think we'll gather at 11:30 as President Nath said. Thank you so much for being here. We look
Thank
forward.
you, Maruna. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Pradhan Babu, for inviting me.
And we look forward to your association with us.